Hello guys, in this video we're going to talk about authentication and authorization. The simplest way to remember it is that authentication is about who you are, authorization is about what you can do. Now let's wire that into a AWS Cognito backed ASP.NET Web API and make that distinction real. We're going to implement a simple web API together and we're going to configure authentication and authorization. Then we're going to use Postman to interact with that API endpoint and we're going to examine the results together. Stay with me. At the end of the video, I have a little bonus for you that not many developers know of. Step 1, I'm going to very quickly show you what we have in AWS Cognito. In AWS Cognito, we have got a user pool created. User pool has got the app client created in it for our simple API that we're just about to implement together. This simple API has got the credentials, client ID, and client secret. Remember, when we're talking about service to service or machine to machine authentication, the concept of actual user doesn't exist. We're talking about two systems or two services communicating and talking to each other. This user pool also has domain. This is where, very important, this bit where the resource server is configured. Step 2, now let's get the API sorted out. Okay, so a very simple .NET Web API. So very quickly, we're going to create a new controller together. So right click over here, add scaffolded item, API controller, hello world controller. Fantastic. And we're going to tidy up a little bit. So we're going to very quickly create a sample get endpoint together. So a public task and string get, let's call it get hello world. Okay, I'm going to use a suggestion from Rider. So from result, that would be enough for the purpose of this video and what we're trying to achieve together. We just want to return something so we can do the most important bit. And if we run it in a debug mode, and then as you can see, it's building it and then now it's running. So, okay, cool. Now we've got the HTTPS and HTTP both running and ready to go. Now let's head to Postman very quickly to interact with our API endpoint. I have copied the address, the base URL, and copied the root of the endpoint, API, and then the name of the controller, and then the type is get, and very simple, not complicated at all, very simple. We're gonna send the get request to the endpoint and then see what we get. So send, we get a hello world returned, and that was the text that we set in our endpoint. The status code is 200, so our API is fully working. Step 3, now let's secure the endpoint together. So instead of starting from configuration for authentication and authorization, I'm going to show you a slightly different way of understanding authentication and authorization in .NET. So let me try to secure this API endpoint by adding the authorized attribute that I hope that most of you are aware of, and then see how the API is going to react to any request coming to this API endpoint when it requires an access token. So let's run the API and head to Postman and interact with this API after adding this authorized attribute. Running. Okay, it's running. Let's go. Okay, back to Postman. Send. As you can see, it is spinning and it's spinning and it's spinning and nothing is happening. Let's head to .NET, see what's going on. So back in .NET, we have got a problem, and this is what I was hoping I can show you. When we're just adding an authorized attribute, that doesn't mean that we have a secure API endpoint. We just added something that is incomplete. So the exception is trying to say an unhandled exception has occurred while executing the request. No authentication scheme was specified, because we are missing a very important part of the authentication and authorization, and that's the whole point of this video. Step 4, let's configure authentication and authorization properly. Okay, now let's configure authentication builder.services.add, if I type builder properly, add authentication. Okay, cool. We're gonna have to install an additional package in .NET so we can configure the authentication based on JWT bearer token. So very easy. We're gonna head to packages, right click, manage NuGet packages. I've already searched for it in there. So JWT bearer, if you just type JWT bearer, you find this package. I'm using the latest version 10 because this solution is based on .NET 10. Okay, that's good. Now I'm gonna carry on with adding JWT bearer default dot adding the authentication scheme, which adds this bearer as a suffix to the token. So, and then I'm going to carry on, add JWT bearer token. I'm going to go with a suggestion. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we have to specify what's the authority that we want to validate the token based on. The authority, you need to find out the authority that your application is based on. Your identity provider has a specific authority URL that you need to paste it in there. So that's our authority. We're going to continue with a little bit more fun. New token validation parameters. We're going to close the statement, tidy up. Okay, let's continue with our authentication configuration. Valid issuer. In this case, a valid issuer is the same as the authority. So I'm going to copy the value of the authority, paste it here. Validate issuer signing key, also set to true. Validate audience, set to false. So the reason that we set validate audience to false is because there is no user. The concept of user or audience doesn't exist. We are doing service-to-service authentication or machine-to-machine authentication. As I have mentioned very briefly, authority and issuer are exactly the same. The valid issuer is going to be checked against the issuer sent in the access token, and authority is going to be used to validate the issuer signing key. There is a whole story behind us, how it is done and how complicated it is, and which is not the part of this video. Okay, now let's continue with adding authorization. I'm going to go with the suggestion. Builder.services.add authorization. This is about adding the authorization to the pipeline. We first start with the authentication and then we finish it with authorization. Okay, I don't know if you have noticed it, but when I was adding all the configuration for authentication and authorization, I've had use authentication and use authorization already added in the code. Normally you don't have it when you start a brand new web API, unless in the template when you're creating your web API, you specify that you want to add authorization to your application, otherwise you don't have it. So I've missed to explain to you what this is and how to do it, but as you can see, it's very simple. After map controllers, use authentication, use authorization in this specific order. We've already got our authorize attribute nicely set up. So guess the next step. The next step is head back to Postman and interact with this API endpoint and then see what happens then. So I have got Postman and Rider IDE running side by side. I have got a post request already set up that sends a post request to AWS Cognito to obtain an access token. And also I have got a get request set up that sends a request to our API that we built together. So now let's get the access token from AWS Cognito. So over here, this is where we're going, and these are our details that we're sending to AWS Cognito. Send, and there we go. This is our access token that we're going to use to send a request to our brand new API. Okay, so our API is running, and I'm going to send a request to our API deliberately without setting up any authentication and see what happens. So send 401 unauthorized. That's because we're not using that access token that we obtained from the AWS Cognito. So the API endpoint responds back and say, you're not authorized to talk to me. Okay, so now let's fix that. Heading back to Postman, sending a post request to AWS Cognito, fetching a fresh token, heading to the get request tab to our API, heading to the authorization tab, choosing bearer token, pasting our new token, send. So as you can see, the breakpoint has been hit, and that means that the call has been successfully authorized or authenticated and authorized. So that's the good news. If I resume and then head back to the Postman, you can see that the hello world has been responded back from the API. Okay, so I hope that you've been enjoying this video until now. So far, we have learned how to configure authentication and authorization. We have implemented a simple API endpoint together. We deliberately tried to interact with this API endpoint without correctly configuring the authorization. In the header, we have received a 401 unauthorized response from the API endpoint. Then we configured it correctly, and then we received a 200 OK return from the API. So what we're going to do now, we're going to extend this a little bit more, having a little bit more fun, and then making some changes to what that API endpoint actually allows the user to do, or allows the other API client interacting with it to do. We're going to delve into a little bit more details and understanding how 403 status code can happen, which is a problem, or how we can solve it. We're going to play with scopes using AWS Cognito. Okay, so head to AWS Cognito, user pool, your user pool, domain, and then I've added read and write. I've already had read when I created the Cognito. I've just added a new one, write, and we're going to use both of them and then see what we can do to receive 403 and then how to fix it. And then what does these two actually mean? What's the point of having the scopes? What sort of flexibility or ability we're going to get? So stay with me. Did you forget something? Let's find out. Okay, a little bit of an AWS Cognito lesson wouldn't hurt. So please head to your AWS Cognito, user pools, open up your user pool, find your app clients, open it, scroll down to logging pages, scroll down to the main page of logging pages, click edit, scroll all the way down, find customer scopes. As you can see, read is already added because we created a write custom scope as well as read, then we have to add the write to our login pages. So we're associating the resource server domain custom scope to our app client. Save changes, then you're good to go. Remember that what we said at the beginning of the video, authorization, answers what you can do. Now it is time to add further configuration to the application by adding the scopes configuration so we can further restrict the API endpoints to what you can and cannot do. Let's dive in. Where add authorization was added before, preparing it to add policy, options.add policy. We're going to start with read only, so name it read only, and then we're going to create the policy function so we can add more customizations to it. Policy.add.require assertion. We're gonna create the function because this one returns something, so it's a function. Back inside the function, continue with the customization and adding the code that we want. So what we want to do first is basically we're looking inside the scope that comes back as a part of the claims. The scope, the value for the scope is space delimited. So we want to extract it, add it into an array, and then read the value and extract the exact scope that we need for this particular policy. Creating the object, calling it raw, the code to read all the values from the scope, splitting all the values inside the scope variable into an array. We don't need the empty entries. Now we just simply need to return the result that we want from this policy. So return scopes.contains the value that we want. We also want to make sure that the string comparer, I'm going to go with a suggestion, is ignoring all the cases. So the value that we want in this example is not read only just like that because Rider is just using the suggestion. I'm going to copy and paste the value that I have. That's the value that AWS Cognito set for the reader scope. So we're going to go with that. So what we have here, we have got a brand new policy that is only based on the read policy or reader scope that we added in AWS Cognito. So what we can do now, we can carry on and continue copying this policy, pasting it here, calling it write only. I'm going to go back up here and then fix the spelling here. So what we have now, we have read only and write. I'm going to go ahead and copy another one, which I will explain why. I'm going to call it delete only. I'm going to change this to delete. I'm going to change this to write, and that's it. So what we have got 3 different policies for read, write, and delete. Okay, so back to the controller, I have got an extra 2 endpoints for write and for delete. And as you can see, I have configured the authorize attribute with the name of the policy that we set up together earlier. So we're going to interact with these 2 endpoints via Postman. Okay, now heading to Postman, we're going to request for a new access token for a write scope. So we're going to send write here. The access token would be based on the write scope. Send, getting the access token, copying the access token over here, heading to the post in here that sends the request to our post endpoint. What we're trying to do is we're trying to confirm that the policy implementation works properly and we don't get 4 or 3 response back from the API. Send the request. As you can see, 200 OK status code returned and we get the response back. However, if I just use the same access token with write scope in it for a delete request to the delete endpoint, if I just paste the new access token here, we're going to the delete endpoint, which is our new endpoint over here. What do you think we're going to get back? What do you think the response would be? Let's find out. Send. Quite rightly, we get 4 or 3 back. That's the whole point. We talk about 4 or 1, who you are, and then now this is 4 or 3, what you can do. We obtained a token from AWS Cognito for a write operation, not for the delete operation. The access token doesn't have the authority or the authorization or access to perform delete because the endpoint that is for delete is protected with this policy. And as you can remember, delete policy has got a specific scope attached to it that is delete. That's the whole point of this video, if I'm honest with you. We talk about 4 or 1, we talk about 4 or 3. Now let's have a little bit more fun. Head back to AWS Cognito. Let's see if we can make this work. Okay, head to AWS Cognito, user pool, scroll down, domain, scroll all the way down, find your resource servers, edit resource servers, add another scope. We're going to add delete. This is an example. Delete the scope. Scroll down, save the changes. Head back to your clients. Find your client, scroll down, logging pages, scroll a little bit down, edit all the way down, custom scopes, add the scope that you just created, save the changes. Now let's head back to Postman. Okay, here we are again, heading to Postman, trying to get an access token for delete. So we're going to change this to delete. send. Brilliant. That's our delete access token. Let's copy the access token, head back to the delete call again, clear this, paste a fresh one. Now let's send, and there we go. We get a successful 200 OK, delete hello world. The endpoint is returning delete hello world, which is that text over here, proving that it works properly. How amazing is that? Simple, but very effective. So the bonus time. Let me tell you this before we head into the bonus time. I'm a big fan of minimal APIs. I don't think that traditional controllers are really useful anymore. However, there are still so many companies out there, so many developers, so many engineers still heavily using the controllers or controller-based API design. And that's absolutely fine. But I think minimal APIs are fundamentally amazing. They are faster, they're easier to work with, they're very flexible, and they removed all of those faff and unnecessary complications of the controllers. And it is less likely for them to become victim to sort of a god sort of level of complexities in controllers. So many people still do that, believe it or not. Let's head back to Rider and then talk about those bonuses that I was talking about. Examine the token validation properties. Most likely you're not going to need to set them, because if you hover your mouse on validate issuer for an instance, you can see that the default behavior or the default value of this particular property is set to true. So you can easily remove this and everything should still work. As long as you have a valid issuer set, you're not going to need this. The system automatically validates the token or validate the issuer without any problem. The other thing that you need to bear in your mind is that when you hover your mouse, you can examine the documentation for each properties, and it gives you a lot of information about what they are for and whether you need to set them or not, because they all have default values. In this particular case, the validate issuer signing key particularly deliberately set to false, so you need to set it to true if you want to. And the other thing is about validate audience. I did mention this right at the beginning of this video, that in this particular case, because the token is service-to-service authentication type of token, you're not going to need to set the validate audience to it because there is no audience as such. This is the case for AWS Cognito. It might be different for other providers. However, because this particular property, if you examine the documentation, you can see that it's set to true by default. If you leave it as is, or even if you forget to set it to false intentionally, you're going to get 401 unauthorized response because the token validation or the mechanism here failed to validate your token because you set this to true and there is no audience. And the last thing that I was going to show you is this. If you go hover your mouse on the add control and study the documentation, you can see that there are some really useful information. If you read this remarks here, it says this method configures the MVC services for the commonly used features. And one of those commonly used features is exactly what we use in this video, add authorization. For those of you still using the traditional controllers to implement your APIs, bear in your mind that if you've got a very simple authentication and authorization mechanism that doesn't use scopes, doesn't use claims, doesn't use roles and things like that, you don't have to customize or decorate your controllers or your controller endpoints with particular policy or role names, you really don't need to set add authorization. You can very simply ignore this or just omit this from your code. Just go ahead with add controllers, because if you don't, then it will be set twice in the application, which is a little bit pointless. And that's it. This was the bonus part of the video. I hope you liked it, and I really thank you for watching this video. As you know, this is my second video in my channel and there is no next video, so unfortunately you have to wait for the future videos if you're watching this for the first time. I will update this video when I got more videos uploaded on my channel to point you guys to the most relevant videos to this particular one. I will be talking more about authorization and authentication in the future. If there is anything in particular you would like to learn about authorization and authentication, please leave your comments and I will definitely look into it. And also, it would mean the whole world if you show your support by leaving comments, liking the video, or even subscribing. Thank you very much for watching again.